Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jeff, and today, in honor of Shaketember, which is a booktube reading event for the month of September, where Shakespeare-inspired content is kind of the thing. I wanted to talk about Shakespeare on screen, so film and television adaptations of Shakespeare. A great way for newbies to Shakespeare to experience Shakespeare is to see it first, see a play. But if you don't live near a metropolitan area, and if you don't live near maybe a specifically arts-friendly metropolitan area, it might be really difficult to see any kind of Shakespeare on stage. So there is definitely a good chunk of Shakespeare that's been done on screen, both small and the large. So I thought I would just go through all of the plays because, I'm a completist, and talk about the notable adaptations or film for television for each one. One thing that's interesting in film Shakespeare is that there's two kinds, obviously. There are the kinds where they're going to film the majority of the play, of the written play, and not cut it very much, or if anything. And that tends to happen when the BBC does their film versions of Shakespeare. They tend to do the full plays, so you really get a full representation of the play. Film versions of Shakespeare are a little different. Film versions of Shakespeare tend to cut, and it varies. So for instance, the Ian McKellen, Richard III, they cut reams of text. It's a very long play, and even so, they cut so much stuff, and what you were left with was plot and notable soliloquies, right? Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, 4-hour film, cut nothing. And I think, strangely enough, won Best Adapted Screenplay that year, which surprised him because he said, it's just Shakespeare's play. I don't know why they gave me an Oscar for filming Shakespeare's play as Best Original Screenplay, which is kind of funny. But, so I'll mention as we go along. I haven't seen all of these. I've seen a good deal of it. And if you're new, I would start with the pieces that, are more text-friendly in terms of hewing closer to the text. So there's a few guidelines and parameters when I set out to do this. Number one, I'm trying to avoid film stage productions. So there's a lot of filmed Shakespeare, especially the Globe Theatre in England, which is where the Royal Shakespeare Company is. They film a lot of their productions. So they do the play, and there's a whole bunch of cameras set up, and they film the whole thing, and then they edit it with different close-ups and wide shots. I'm trying to avoid that because that's a different animal. When you're not setting up the play for, when you're not filming it, it's still a wonderful way to experience it. And if it's a good production with good values, and if it's done really well, it can be a great way to watch a Shakespeare play for sure. And more than likely, being a stage production, you're going to get most of the play. But I'm avoiding it for the most part. There's a few exceptions here, but for the most part, I'm going to try to avoid those. I'm also going to skip adaptations and inspirations. Kiss Me Kate is a famous musical based on Taming of the Shrew. I'm avoiding all that. West Side Story based on Romeo and Juliet, because that's for the purposes of this. That would be a whole nother video where I would do inspired by Shakespeare, which what isn't, right? I'm also not going to include modern language adaptations. There are some screen adaptations where they just do it in modern language, and to me, what's the point? And I won't include foreign language adaptations, except for a few notable ones, which I want to mention, which are kind of really beyond the realm of good. They're just really amazing films. But that's, again, a whole other animal that I've seen virtually none of them, except for, one specific director. So I'm going to also exclude those. Before I start, I also want to mention two resources. So the BBC decided in the late 70s that they were going to film every one of Shakespeare's plays to kind of document it. And they wouldn't be film stage productions. They'd be, TV productions. Now, that may be that a lot of it does take place on stages and in one scene, but the camera's also moving around. There could be exterior shots. So it's a film production. It's not just the play, even though a lot of the BBC versions are play-ish. So it's a wonderful resource. I think the entire set is the BBC television Shakespeare collection. It's like $200. But it's an amazing document. And there's some wonderful versions with some really notable actors, which I will get to when I get to each individual play. So that is a resource that may be at your local library. Definitely you can rent them on Amazon. Some of them are even on YouTube. There's a whole plethora of that stuff, but it was a wonderful thing. And then something else was done, Shakespeare, the Animated Collection, where there were half-hour animated shorts done with the plays. I guess with the notion of trying to get younger viewers to get a taste of Shakespeare before they, were old enough to really read and do the plays. So if you have children and you're curious, check out Shakespeare, the Animated Collection. Again, probably available if you Google around the tubes. One last note before I start, I'm going to time code all of the plays. So, you may just not want to watch, it's hard to believe you may not want to watch my entire show. But if you don't, you're just interested in learning about some adaptations for certain plays, every play will be time coded below in the description box, and you can jump right to that play and check it out. Okay, so I'm going to start with the history plays. I'll do this by category. Shakespeare's plays are categorized by comedy, history, and tragedy. So I'm going to start with the histories. So the chunk of plays, Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, Henry V, Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III, kind of represent a dramatic historical retelling of the Wars of the Roses. And they're kind of one long story. So there's a couple of notable productions that have done it in that spirit. The first one being Orson Welles' film Chimes at Midnight. So it came out in 1966. And it's cut up. Like, it's not, if you did all those plays together, it'd be 7-8 hours or more. So Welles took chunks of Richard II, Henry IV, part 1 and 2, Henry V, and The Merry Wives of Windsor. And he made this film, which I've still yet to see. I'm dying to see it. And I think it's notable only because I've heard people talk about the battle scenes in the recent Lord of the Rings films. Recent, 2001, oh my God. And that some of them, that maybe Jackson had watched Chimes at Midnight battle scenes. So I'm like, oh, that'd be interesting. So I haven't seen it yet. But so Welles did kind of a smattering to tell a larger story as well. Now, the BBC did this twice. The BBC did something in 1960 called The Age of Kings. And they did 8 plays into about hour and a half chunks. So it's not, it's not perfect. They cut some stuff and amalgamated some things, but it's a hell of a document. And it's notable for Sean Connery. I think he plays Hotspur or Hal in one of them. A young Connery before he was in the James Bond movies. So it's kind of interesting. So it's called The Age of Kings. You can get it on Amazon as a collection. It's pretty, the filming, what I've seen on YouTube, it doesn't look great. It looks very stagey. I don't know, maybe the DVDs, they've cleaned up the image a little bit. But, and then they did something very similar recently in 2012 called The Hollow Crown, which was also, again, telling the larger stories, which I have not seen in its entirety. I've checked out a few of the plays, and they do definitely make significant cuts in some of them. But it's pretty notable because Tom Hiddleston is in it, Benedict Cumberbatch, Michelle Dockery, Jeremy Irons. Like, it's got some amazing talent. And I think Hiddleston plays Hal in Henry IV, Henry V. He's Henry V, obviously. So yeah, some notable folks, and that's BBC. I think The Hollow Crown is currently in September here in 2023, free on Prime if you have Amazon Prime. So yeah, so as far as the history plays go, chunks, amalgamated history plays, you can access it from those sources. Okay, so I'm just going to take it play by play, and I'll start with the first one, I guess chronologically in this, War of the Roses set, Richard II. There's no feature film of Richard II, but the 1978, Shakespeare BBC televised version stars Derek Jacobi. So well worth checking out for Jacobi because he's amazing. John Gielgud is in it and John Finch. So 3 powerhouse actors in that version. So really amazing. Henry IV, outside of Orson Welles' Chimes at Midnight, no film adaptations. The BBC complete version has Anthony Quayle as Falstaff and John Finch and Tim Pigott-Smith as well. So pretty well cast. And then it was done by the BBC as a one-off in 1991 as well. Henry V, two wonderfully notable films, which I would highly recommend, are Laurence Olivier's 1944 version, which is just a wonderful, wonderful film. It starts out where you're kind of a documentary filming the play in the Globe Theatre back in the 1600s, and you think he's going to do it this way. And then in a wonderful thing, I won't spoil, it kind of breaks out into a more realistic thing. It's wonderful, so I would highly recommend it. And then, of course, Kenneth Branagh's 1989 version of Henry V, which is superlative. Brian Blessed, Paul Scofield, Emma Thompson, Judi Dench, Branagh. It's an amazing film. It's amazing that it did so well. Hollywood really gobbled it up. I think it might have won some Oscars that year. But, and very faithful. I think both Olivier and Branagh include a lot of the text in Henry V, from what I can remember. So, well worth seeing. It's in the BBC Complete Collection as well, and no notable actors that I could tell. Henry VI is the next one. Henry VI is usually cut up into parts 1, 2, and 3. There are no film adaptations of it, and it is included in the BBC Complete Shakespeare. Richard III was filmed 3 times, or 2.5, as you'll see. The first time, Olivier, 1955, and it's a wonderful adaptation. Really, really great. Olivier is Richard. John Gielgud is in it. Ralph Richardson and Claire Bloom. Wonderfully shot. And interesting in how it plays with both Hamlet and Richard III. Olivier does voiceover. So there are times when you see the character moving on the set in the scene and you're hearing Shakespeare as a voiceover. And they have to time it perfectly, because sometimes there'll be bits of voiceover and then he'll start speaking it, but it'll be in the middle of a line, middle of a speech. Like half is in his head, then half of it's speaking, and then he goes back to in his head. Very clever, really well thought out and directed. So his Richard III is great. Then this director, Richard Loncraine, in 1995, did a version, which was based on, I think, the BBC production. So it was Ian McKellen, who's like a superlative Shakespearean. Annette Bening, Nigel Hawthorne, Kristen Scott Thomas, Maggie Smith, and Robert Downey Jr. is in it. I don't like it because they sacrificed the play for action. So they're including, and it's set in sort of like a mid-20th century totalitarian state, so very militaristic. And I think that's how the RRC staged it. I think they toured it in the States, and a friend told me about it and said McKellen was like, it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing to see him do that. And he's magnetic and wonderful on screen. And when the good English actors are on screen, it's great. The American actors, not so much. But again, they cut the play to ribbons. So to me, it's not a very satisfying Shakespearean experience, even though it's technically the play. Then a year later, Al Pacino released a film called Looking for Richard. It was a documentary about him getting his arms around Richard III. So it's a handful of scenes. Then it's actors talking about how to play it and stuff. It's filmed in very, almost 8mm. It's a very kind of off the cuff shot. And it's okay. It's notable. I wouldn't go near it unless you're an avid Shakespearean and you're curious. It's kind of a mess. But he's magnetic. He's been in 2 Shakespeare films, Merchant of Venice and this one. He was much better in Merchant of Venice. So this is kind of hit and miss, I would say. And Richard III, as in TV, was covered in also, of course, in the Shakespeare collection for the BBC. And the remaining 2 history plays, King John. Interesting note about King John. It was the very first Shakespearean film. It was a silent, filmed in 1899. And it's never been shot on film again, which is interesting. But the BBC covered it in their Complete Shakespeare. And Henry VIII also never filmed the play, the Shakespearean play, but included in the BBC's collection. Okay, moving on to the tragedies. We'll start with, the little-known one called Hamlet, which you probably never heard of. One of the most filmed Shakespearean plays ever. The first notable production was 1948, Laurence Olivier, with Gene Simmons as Ophelia. Wonderful film. Olivier very much caught up in Freudianism, so there's a whole lot more attention paid to Hamlet's relationship with his mother, based on kind of Freud's theories. It's a wonderful film, really wonderful film, highly recommend it. Then in 1969, a director named Tony Richardson filmed Nicole Williamson's Hamlet, with Anthony Hopkins as Claudius and Marianne Faithfull as Ophelia. And Nicole Williamson most notable to general audiences as Merlin in Excalibur. So I've never seen his version. I know he was 1,000 years old when he played it, so it seemed his Hamlet was like, you know, the aging Hamlet. But he is he's kind of a very big, showy British actor. So I'm very curious as to what that is like. But that was 1969. And then in 1990, Franco Zeffirelli shot it with Mel Gibson in the lead. And he's surrounded by Alan Bates as Claudius, Glenn Close as Gertrude, Paul Scofield as the Ghost, Ian Holm as Polonius, and Helena Bonham Carter as Ophelia. It's probably the best Ophelia on screen. Helena Bonham Carter is great. And the funny thing about this movie is that Gibson's not terrible, but he's no Shakespearean. He does all right. He gets into kind of a very neurotic, you know, mode when he's doing it. And it's not bad, but the film holds up because of the supporting cast. They're so great. And Gibson's the star, but he's the weakest performer. So again, it's a very interesting production. And because it's Zeffirelli, it's shot really beautifully, a lot of exteriors. One notable exception to the adaptation rule, also in 1990, was a film of the play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard. It's a play, a very famous play by Tom Stoppard. So in Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are messengers sent to England, and Claudius basically gives them information to give to the English king when Hamlet gets there to have them killed, right? Hamlet figures it out on the way and changes the message. So when the English king opens it up, the message says, please kill these two, traitors, whatever, and they die. And there's a single line later in the play where Claudius finds out Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, my lord, whatever. So Tom Stoppard wrote a play from the point of view of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as if they were, from their point of view, the whole play. Dialogue, story, the whole thing. And it starts with them being sent on the mission, and it ends with their death, obviously. And it's Gary Oldman and Eric Roth. And it's an amazing movie in its own right. It's one of these adaptations, because Tom Stoppard is such a preeminent playwright and a genius in his own right. But it's an amazing play. And again, I would highly recommend, once you kind of get a sense of Hamlet, to totally check it out. And then 1996, probably the crowning Hamlet these days, Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, with Derek Jacobi as Claudius, Julie Christie as Gertrude, Richard Briers as Polonius, and then blink if you missed him. Branagh loves casting American actors in smaller roles in his plays, his Shakespeare adaptations. I think because he feels like, it'll widen out the audience. In Much Ado, Keanu was in it, and Denzel. So, blink if you'll miss them in Hamlet. Billy Crystal is in it, Robin Williams, and then Charlton Heston in these bit roles. And it's a hit and miss. It's a mess. I feel like Much Ado About Nothing and Henry V were really wonderful, wonderful adaptations, really great. Hamlet was a mess. I love it still, but it's hit and miss. Sometimes it can be. Branagh has turned out to be a director with too much flourish, too much emotion. Like he's a little histrionic in his presentation of certain things. And Hamlet suffers a little bit from that, but not in the performances, but sometimes in the way things are directed and how the camera is moving. It's the spinning camera he uses and everything. But I love it. It's kind of a masterpiece, and it's the whole play, which is amazing. So, for fans of Hamlet, it's kind of a must check out. Then in 2000, the last notable filming version of Hamlet was directed by this guy, Michael Almereyda. And it was Ethan Hawke as Hamlet, Kyle MacLachlan as Claudius, Diane Venora as Gertrude, Sam Shepard as the Ghost, Liev Schreiber as Laertes, and Julia Stiles as Ophelia, Bill Murray as Polonius. And it's cut up, and it's sort of near future New York City, high-rise. Everything takes place in these richy high-rise apartments. But some of the soliloquies are okay. Hawke does okay. Nothing out of the park, but it's curious. It's curiosity. And TV, it's been done. Hamlet has been done. 1964, Christopher Plummer. In addition to that, Robert Shaw was Claudius. Donald Sutherland as Fortinbras. Michael Caine as Horatio. In 1980, Derek Jacobi played Hamlet, and that's one worth seeking out. It's an amazing version. In 2000, Campbell Scott, the actor who's in a bunch of David Mamet films, did a made-for-TV movie version of Hamlet. It's cut up, but it's interesting. And then in 2009, the BBC filmed one with David Tennant. And Patrick Stewart is Claudius. So I haven't seen that one yet, but I'm curious about that. So definitely a raft of Hamlet. The next film is Macbeth, and Macbeth as well was filmed a lot. Those probably Hamlet and Macbeth were the two most filmed Shakespeare plays. So the first notable Hamlet film was Orson Welles' 1948 version, which is very good. Black and white, very atmospheric. Welles is magnificent, great supporting cast. They all affect Scottish accents, I think, and Welles's can come and go at times, but well worth checking out. In the 1950s, Laurence Olivier wanted to film it, and he couldn't get the funding, which is amazing. So I just was doing research for this. I found that out, and I thought, well, it would have been wonderful to have his Macbeth on screen. In 1957, a film came out. So this is one of my few foreign language exceptions. Akira Kurosawa, who's a Japanese film director. Most notable for Yojimbo and Seven Samurai. He filmed an adaptation of Macbeth called Throne of Blood, and it's an amazing movie. Amazing film. Obviously, you're not getting the language, but it's a hell of a film in its own right, and I'd highly recommend it. In 1971 was another amazing version, Roman Polanski, who famously directed Rosemary's Baby, and Chinatown directed Macbeth with John Finch as Macbeth, Francesca Annis as Lady Macbeth, Martin Shaw as Banquo. It's an amazing film. It's really gritty and bloody, like a real down in the dirt Macbeth, but great performances, really wonderfully presented. So I would recommend that one as well. 2006, I just discovered this one. 2006, Jeffrey Wright directed a Macbeth starring Sam Worthington. I was like, what the hell? Where did this come from? I guess they got Australian money and made it there. I've never seen it. I think it was probably direct-to-video or something, but I just thought that's a curiosity. So if anyone's seen it, let me know if it was any good. In 2015, this director named Justin Kurziel directed a Macbeth with Michael Fassbender, who is most known probably for playing Magneto in the X-Men films. Marianne Cotillard played Lady Macbeth. Elizabeth Debicki was in it as Ophelia. No, she was Lady Macduff, excuse me. David Thewlis was in it as Duncan. There was no Ophelia in this. I didn't like it at all. It was just filmed, everything on location. It was all plot, very little. They cut the play to pieces. And the dialogue scenes, these days when Shakespeare's filmed, they're trying to do it more realistically. Whereas back in the day, characters would pause and have their speeches. Now in film, they're trying to make it seamlessly part of the scene and have the actors, mutter it or speak it in more kind of conversational tones, which I don't like, actually. I understand why that's been done, but I don't like it. And I don't think Shakespeare intended it to be spoken in such a vernacular like that. And as much as I like Fassbender as an actor, there was nothing to it. It was really nothing to it. And then in 2021, Joel Coen did one in black and white with Denzel Washington as Macbeth and Frances McDormand as Lady Macbeth, Brendan Gleeson as Duncan. I didn't see it. I don't know why. I didn't know, Americans making Shakespeare. I'm always, really, can we do it? But it got very good reviews, and Denzel was in Much Ado About Nothing that Kenneth Branagh did years ago. So I'm curious. Yeah, at some point I'll have to scan it. But anyway, that's the latest one on screen. On TV, it was done a bunch of times. So in 1960, it was done with Maurice Evans and Judith Anderson. Now, Maurice Evans is basically as Dr. Zaius in Planet of the Apes, if you don't know who he is. In 1961, Canadian TV did one with Sean Connery as Macbeth, and it's not bad. Check out some scenes, the Tomorrow and Tomorrow speeches on YouTube, and Connery's pretty good. I was impressed. I wasn't expecting much, but yeah, so that was interesting. The BBC did it in '78, Ian McKellen and Judi Dench. To me, I highly recommend this. I've never, as much as I've seen Shakespeare, as much as I've seen Macbeth and read Macbeth, the Lady Macbeth character never really popped for me until I saw Judi Dench do it in this version. She's unbelievable. What she does with Lady Macbeth, and I finally, after years, I was like, I kind of get this character now because of her. And McKellen is, the two of them are just, you can't take your eyes off them. So highly recommend that version. In 1981, Jeremy Brett did it for the BBC. He's most known for being the BBC's Sherlock Holmes throughout the 80s. In 1983, Nicole Williamson did it. And then in 2010, Patrick Stewart did it as part of actually he did it on stage and he did this TV version. It's pretty good. And the TV version is filmed, it's on location. You know, it's not a stagey thing. And I saw him do it on stage at the Public Theater in New York when it came around, and it was very good. But I would recommend that as well, film version. Romeo and Juliet, next. Filmed in 1954 by someone named Renato Castellani, with John Gielgud as the chorus and Lawrence Harvey as Romeo, which I've never heard of this one, so it might be something I might seek out. But the most notable one is Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. It's wonderful. It's like the best version on screen. Leonard Whiting is Romeo, who disappeared. Olivia Hussey is Juliet. Michael York is Tybalt, and Laurence Olivier is the chorus. But it's filmed wonderfully. All the performances are good. Like one of the best ever on screen. And then it was done by Baz Luhrmann, of all people, as Romeo plus Juliet. When did this come out? 1996. And I don't know. It's kind of a big mess. I think Luhrmann just went for a lot of big stuff. A lot of text is still there. And DiCaprio and Claire Danes as Juliet, they're okay. I don't know, it's kind of a curiosity. I think John Leguizamo's Tybalt is probably my favorite part of it. Pete Postlewaite plays the Friar Lawrence, when Pete Postlewaite comes on screen, you're like, oh, a Shakespearean, because he's so good. But it's something, and it's, you know, it's a big Baz Luhrmann extravaganza, so it's got, you know, the kitchen sink in there. And, you know, you'll either appreciate it or you'll hate it, depending on whether you're slavish to the text or you kind of like adaptations. So it's fun. It's a lot of fun. It was done on TV in 1978. Anthony Andrews played Mercutio, Alan Rickman played Tybalt, and John Gielgud was the chorus. Okay, next up we have Julius Caesar. So a brief cut-in for the first film of Julius Caesar, which was done in 1954 by Joseph Mankiewicz, starring Marlon Brando as Mark Antony, James Mason as Brutus, and John Gielgud as Caesar. It's an amazing film, black and white, very, very close to the play. They made some cuts, but you wouldn't really notice it. So very, very highly recommended. And then it was done again in 1970 with Charlton Heston directing and playing Mark Antony. And it's marred by Jason Robards' impersonation of a tree trunk throughout the whole one. He's the most boring Brutus you've ever seen. Heston is good. Diana Rigg plays Portia. Gielgud is Caesar. But it's, Robards tanks it, unfortunately. On TV, again, it's part of the complete BBC collection as well. Next up is Othello. And Othello was filmed in 1951 by Orson Welles. It was during Welles' directorial period where he was kind of in exile. He was traveling all over the world. He wanted to do Othello, so he would go someplace, he would drum up some money, he would film a bunch of scenes, then he would put it on the shelf, then a year would go by, he would find some other money, put it on the shelf, you know, film a bunch of scenes. So it's a mess. Like, it is a mess. It's very curious though. It's this incredible black and white document. Some of the shots are beautiful. Like, it has a lot of his style in it. The performances are very hit and miss. The editing is very jarring. It's almost like Romeo and Juliet by Luhrmann. It's a curiosity, but it's well worth seeking out if you're a Welles fan or Shakespeare fan. Famously, 1965, Laurence Olivier did it with Derek Jacobi as Michael Cassio. Now, this is now very much, nobody watches it because Olivier decided to do it in blackface. And he put on this really weird accent. So, yeah, nowadays it's... and it's odd, even, you know, I've seen it, and it's an odd choice. The blackface, it is what it is. Like, it's in horrible taste. But he puts on this weird lisping accent that I find very jarring and off-putting. So I never really settle into watching the play. And it's a film performance, but it's just notable to mention. Another brief cut-in. The next Othello film, 1995, directed by Oliver Parker, and starred Lawrence Fishburne in the lead role. And Fishburne was very good, surprisingly. He was good, and but unfortunately, however good he was overshadowed by Kenneth Branagh, who played Iago. It's a film that not many people talk about, but it's very good. Irene Yacob plays Desdemona. It was shot really well on location somewhere. Beautiful exteriors, and well worth checking out. Okay, moving on. Titus Andronicus. A single film adaptation was done recently. If I would have done my research well, I would have put the date on here. Julie Taymor did it with Anthony Hopkins, probably in the early 2000s, I think. Jessica Lange, Alan Cumming, Com Fior. I liked it. Cuts the play up a little bit because it's a pretty long play, but it's interesting. I think I'm kind of half on it, half in, half out. It didn't blow me out of the water, but it was interesting to see that play done on the big screen. And it's part of the big Shakespeare collection on TV as well. Antony and Cleopatra was filmed notably once in 1972. Charlton Heston, I guess he got the Shakespeare bug in the early 70s. He directed it and also starred as Mark Antony. I haven't seen it. And it's also part of the BBC Complete. King Lear was some notable productions of Lear. In 1971, director Peter Brook did it with Paul Scofield. It's a grim, brutal Lear. Takes place, it's all cold and snow. It's the bleakest Shakespeare thing I've ever seen, but Scofield is incredible. I remember listening to an audio version of the play that Scofield did while I read it at one point, and it was amazing. So he's a towering figure, Scofield. The next one so this is one of my exceptions. In 1985, again, Japanese director Akira Kurosawa directed it. It was called Ran, R-A-N. Long film. Beautiful, beautiful film of the story. You know, not the text, obviously, but of the story. And one I would recommend. It's long. It's a long slog. I made sure I went to the theater to see it because I knew that if I tried to watch it at home, I'd never make it. So I went to the theater and I got a seat in the middle of the row so I couldn't go anywhere. And it was well worth it. It was an amazing film. Then in 1999, Brian Blessed, who plays the ghost in Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, Hawkman in Flash Gordon, anyone? He filmed one, which I've never seen. And I guess it's a feature film. It was released, so that's out there. There's some amazing TV versions of this. So Orson Welles did a live TV broadcast of this in 1953. Olivier did a TV version in 83. Ian McKellen did one in 2008. And in 2018, Anthony Hopkins did one. And in Hopkins's version, Emma Thompson, Emily Watson, and Florence Pugh play the daughters. So I kind of want to see that one, actually. I forgot about that. So that's Lear. Coriolanus, as far as I can tell, the only film was the 2012 film with Ralph Fiennes and Gerard Butler, which suffered from too much style, too little substance. I saw Ralph Fiennes do Coriolanus and Richard II in Rep, and he was amazing. But this cuts the play to shreds, and it's doing it in person. Again, another militaristic setting. I forgot that Gerard Butler was in it, which is too interesting. But it was also filmed for the BBC. Then the remaining tragedies, Cymbeline, Troilus and Cressida, Timon of Athens, were all done by the BBC in their big collection. Cymbeline has Richard Johnson, Claire Bloom, and Helen Mirren. And Timon of Athens has Jonathan Pryce in it, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so we're moving on to the comedies of Shakespeare. This is the last section. And of course, the first one was probably the most filmed. It's Much Ado About Nothing. And it was filmed twice. In 1993, Kenneth Branagh's version did it, which was really my introduction to Shakespeare. I'll always have a special place in my heart for that film. And it's a terrific Shakespeare film. It's wonderfully directed. I would say it's better than Henry V, only because it's shorter. And it's just, you know, you move through it. And it's a delight from beginning to end. So highly recommended it. There was a writer's strike in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And Joss Whedon, famous for Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the Avengers movies he made, was hanging around his house, bored out of his mind, and he decided to do Much Ado About Nothing in his house with all the actor friends that he knew. So there's a version you can see, Much Ado About Nothing. It's got a bunch of people that have been in his movies. I've never seen it, so it is kind of a curiosity. I'm not sure how good it is, but it's out there. So Much Ado was done on TV a bunch of times. In 1967, it was done. Maggie Smith was in it. Then in '84, the BBC did it as part of their big collection. And then 2005, another version was done with Damian Lewis, who is lately of Billions fame, to my mind, Band of Brothers fame. He was in it, and Billy Piper. The next comedy, The Tempest. First time, so this is another exception. The science fiction film Forbidden Planet pretends to be a sci-fi retelling of The Tempest. And I don't know The Tempest that well. I don't actually, because I haven't read it. So I couldn't tell you if it was faithful or not. Obviously, I've seen the film, and there's no language like that, but go figure. And then in 2010, Julie Taymor brought it to the screen, and the main character, who normally is played by a man, was played by Helen Mirren this time. So Prospero is the main character, and I think in her version it was Prospera. Haven't seen it, want to read the play and get an understanding of it before I see that version, but I definitely will seek it out at some point. It was done also for the BBC collection, obviously. Merchant of Venice. So the first time it was filmed for the big screen was recently, 2004, starring Al Pacino, Jeremy Irons, and Joseph Fiennes. And it's good, very good, solid, fastball down the middle adaptation. Pacino's very good, Irons is good, Joseph Fiennes is good, so I'd recommend it. Maggie Smith did one in 1972, and then 73 version is Olivier, Jeremy, Brett, Joan Plowright. And then it was done again as part of a Shakespeare collection that BBC did. Midsummer Night's Dream, tons of adaptations, tons. So I've only picked out the ones that I thought were notable. In 1968, it was done on the big screen with Ian Holm, Diana Rigg, Helen Mirren, Ian Richardson, and Judi Dench. And then in 1999, Kevin Kline, Rupert Everett, Michelle Pfeiffer, Stanley Tucci, Christian Bale, Dominic West, kind of more of an American cast. I think I started watching some of it, and I just I have trouble with American actors doing. The only American actor who I ever saw to do Shakespeare that floored me was Charlton Heston doing the Player King in Hamlet. It was just unbelievable, good, unbelievably good. And he was also very good in his adaptations. The films themselves were not great, but he's one of the, the only American that I've really ever seen that I think has really knocked it out of the park. So if there are others, people watching this, if there are other adaptations that have good American Shakespearean performers, let me know. I'm curious. On TV, it was done notably in '81. Helen Mirren was in it. Okay, moving on. Love's Labour's Lost was famously done by Kenneth Branagh as a musical, which I thought was really terrible. I was looking forward to Branagh being sort of the film's Shakespearean. Everybody loved him. He was famous. He made other films. He always was able to get funding. I'm like, all right, he's going to do all the major plays on the big screen. It's going to be great. And after Hamlet, he did 2 of Shakespeare's comedies, and that was it. It was done. And it was such a crushing disappointment to me. And now he's making Agatha Christie movies. I miss him. I miss someone having the clout to make Shakespeare films. But I found that the idea to make it a musical was misguided. It was done, and the BBC did it on TV in 1985. And then As You Like It was also done 3 times on film, actually. Olivier did it in '36, and then in '92 it was done with James Fox, Cyril Cusack, and then Branagh did it again, 2006. I think it was the last Shakespeare film he did. Bryce Dallas Howard was in it, and it was done, I think, as if it was Japanese, took place in Japan. Again, wonderful production design, but just to me, it just died. It was just a dead adaptation, which was a real shame. And on television in 1978, Helen Mirren did it. So next is The Taming of the Shrew. It was done famously in 1967 by Franco Zeffirelli with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. I have not seen it. It's on my to-do list because I would imagine that it's terrific. And it was done as part of the BBC series on TV with John Cleese. So I was curious about that as well. Next is Two Gentlemen of Verona. There was a film in 1931 called A Spray of Plum Blossoms, which is the only film adaptation. I've never even heard of it, so I have no idea if it's a textual adaptation or, just a one-off. And it's also part of the BBC's TV series. Measure for Measure was not done as a film, but it's part of the BBC's TV series. Kate Nelligan was in one of them, and then Tom Wilkinson, Corin Redgrave were in another one. And then there were a bunch more in the 2000s that the BBC did. They seem to like that play. Twelfth Night is next. That was a film in 1996. The 90s were the sweet spot for Shakespeare films. Boy, it was amazing how many of them were in that. Thanks to Kenneth Branagh. There was like this wonderful bell curve, and then to like 2000's Michael Almereyda's Hamlet, and it was over. So Twelfth Night, 1996, Helena Bonham Carter starred in Imogen Stubbs, which I have not seen. And on TV, it was done in 69 with Joan Plowright and Alec Guinness and Ralph Richardson. And then in 88, Kenneth Branagh did it as part of, I think, obviously probably the RSC at that point, and they filmed it. So I mentioned it because it's Branagh, but there is a film version of him doing it. The Winter's Tale is the next play, no film adaptations, and on TV in 1961 with Robert Shaw, 1967 again with Lawrence Harvey, and then as part of the BBC's collection. And then the rest of the comedies, Pericles, All's Well That Ends Well, The Two Noble Kinsmen, Comedy of Errors, and The Merry Wives of Windsor. No film adaptations, but they were included in the Shakespeare collection of the BBC. So that's it. Those are a collection of notable Shakespeare performances on big screen and small screen that I've dug up and thought about. And I just thought it might be fun to do a show, and hope maybe, you've discovered some ones that you didn't know about. It sends you off watching more Shakespeare, which is always a good thing. Thanks for watching.